All right. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Cornell Integrated Pest Management Program's webinar, Endangered Species Act and Pesticides, an example. My name is Mike Helms, and I am the program leader for Cornell's Pesticide Safety Education Program, which is a part of the Cornell Integrated Pest Management Program. I'll be serving as your moderator today. The Cornell Integrated Pest Management Program develops methods and educational programs to assist in pest management with the aim of mitigating environmental, health, and economic risks. The Pesticide Safety Education Program that I lead provides training and outreach on the proper use of pesticides and can also assist answering pesticide-related questions. And now for today's program. Today we welcome Bill Chisholm, Chair of the Endangered Species Act Committee of the Weed Science Society of America, to talk more about the Endangered Species Act and pesticides. Bill grew up working on a vegetable farm in the Salinas Valley of California. He worked for Cooperative Extension in California, conducting weed control research on vegetable crops. After receiving his PhD in weed science from Virginia Tech, he worked for 10 years for a pesticide registrar. He retired after 21 years at the EPA, conducting assessments on the benefits of pesticides to farmers as part of the registration review process. Thanks, Bill, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for having me here today. I just want to say I'm really happy to speak on this process. The Endangered Species Act is going to impact pesticides. I think a lot of growers, consultants, etc., don't know this is going on. And so part of the role of our committee is to give some general information to people to help raise awareness. Years ago, and actually not many years ago, I always thought endangered species were those furry little critters, right? The gray wolf, black bear, the Rufa red knot. And I thought, you know, the ESA, it's looking at construction projects, bridges, dams, roads, permanent kind of structures. I was totally wrong. The ESA is going to impact pesticides. I worked for 20 years for the Office of Pesticide Programs. I didn't realize this was headed our way, but it is truly coming our way. During the presentation, I tried to throw in some examples of endangered species. I'll talk about those in a minute, but I've always said that if you don't know you have endangered species, it's really hard to start the thought process of how to protect them. So what is the Endangered Species Act? The act was first passed in 1973, 50 years ago. It requires government agencies to ensure any actions they take will not threaten any species that have been federally listed as endangered or threatened. Typically, when an agency has a proposed action that might affect endangered species or their habitat, they consult with one of the agencies that enforce this. The agencies are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services or the U.S. National Marine Fisheries Service. When talking about those, the Endangered Species Act talks about a consultation with the services. Either of these two agencies then delivers a biological opinion, which determines if the proposed action another federal agency is taking would cause jeopardy or adverse effects to any listed species. If the action could cause jeopardy or an adverse effect, the federal agency has to modify their action to avoid that harm. The Endangered Species Act is very clear about that. They have to modify their action to make sure they don't jeopardize or affect those species. So how does this affect pesticide use? The Environmental Protection Agency oversees pesticide use. Because pesticides, I'm a weed scientist, including herbicides, can affect animals and plants, pesticide registrations are considered actions that would trigger an endangered species consultation. In several recent court decisions, the federal courts have told the EPA they must comply with the ESA. I just want to make that clear. The EPA didn't just suddenly say, well, we can avoid doing this. The courts have told them they have to apply these standards to pesticide registrations. I want to point out that benefits are not considered under the ESA. A lot of folks have said, well, you know, I can't farm without this given pesticide. It's really not part of the ESA statute. The impacts on growers are not considered. So current registrations do consider the ESA. Early in 2000, the EPA introduced an additional safety factor to protect listed species. There's a 10-fold safety factor for terrestrial species and a 20-fold safety factor for aquatic species. So the agency, for years, has been attempting to protect endangered species. Why am I hearing about this now? Simply put, the EPA has not done the required ESA consultations with the services, and it's been 5 decades. Several attempts have been made by the pesticide program to do this, but it's never been fully implemented. And as you'll see, this is really a difficult task for them to do. It is not easy. There's overlapping regulations that they have to consider. This has left many pesticides vulnerable to lawsuits. The EPA has spent many years in court defending registrations to keep these pesticides on the market. But to make these pesticide registrations more secure from litigation, the EPA is now going to fully comply with the Endangered Species Act. So what they said in 2022 is that every new active ingredient will go through ESA consultation with the services, and pesticide re-registrations will begin going through the consultation process as well. When is it going to happen? In 2022, as I said, the EPA said they will start requiring an ESA consultation for every new registration. And in addition, all current pesticide registrations are going to begin going through the consultation process as well. We're starting to see some changes. I have an example later in the presentation for Enlist One and Enlist Duo. They were some of the first herbicides to go completely through the ESA consultation before registration. How does it affect me? I like to think of the endangered species as they have a range. If your field overlaps their range, and if you're going to use a pesticide that's on the list that could harm them, then it's going to impact you. So it's where are the species and where does agricultural usage overlap? In the future, registrations are going to require several changes. So one of the requirements we see on the Enlist label is a requirement to check an EPA website called Bulletins Live 2. Several other pesticides require that as well. There's going to be limitations on what county they can be used on. There's going to be limitations on applications to saturated soil. There's going to be additional mitigations on the label to reduce drift and runoff and erosion. And we talk about pick lists and mitigation lists. The user is going to have to pick from those mitigations in order to protect the endangered species. In short, farmers and applicators should prepare for some new requirements on their herbicide labels. And at the end, I'll mention a couple things you can do to start thinking about it and getting prepared. Why should I care? The ESA has prevented the extinction of roughly 291 species and has saved more than 99% of the species under its protection. Currently, many pesticide registrations are easily challenged in court. In general, the EPA has been losing those lawsuits. If the agency doesn't consider ESA and mitigations to protect them, the courts could start vacating. They could start removing registrations from the label. And that would be a very sad situation, and that would be potentially catastrophic to growers because it would happen suddenly. The agency realized that having registrations that are facing lawsuits is not a sustainable situation. So that's why they're trying to fully comply with the ESA. And ideally, this would give farmers and applicators a more stable, reliable access to the pesticides they need. So I've gotten some questions, and thank you everybody that sent in questions ahead of time. Questions about compliance, who's going to enforce these? Pesticides are regulated under FIFRA. I personally think that the state lead agencies were going to be responsible for enforcing these. How they do it, I think you should take your questions to the state pesticide regulatory agencies and ask them. Will it go away? Is this some sort of administrative thing that will go away with the new party in charge? Excellent question. Any modifications would require bipartisan support. My example here has always been Congress currently has trouble passing a budget. Passing something like modification to the Endangered Species Act would be incredibly difficult. It would take an awful lot of time and expertise to do successfully. I don't anticipate them doing that. I just don't. And in addition, the ESA has been successfully functioning for 50 years. It's been used in forestry. It's been used in national parks. It's been used thousands of places for decades. So I think it would be difficult to get other groups to agree to changes. So I don't see it changing. This is a nice visual I like. I got this from Ryan DeWitt from National Marine Fisheries Service. In this box, the larger the box, the more species that are part of that. So as you can see, plants, fish, mammals, insects, clams, as you get towards the right, it gets smaller and smaller. The bottom box is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has many more species in their list than the National Marine Fisheries Service. So most of our discussions are with Fish and Wildlife Service. So let's talk a little bit about the endangered species. There's about 1,700 threatened and endangered species in the US, DC, and the territories. Over half of those species are plants. I'm a weed scientist. Herbicides obviously can impact plants. Our society is very concerned about the interactions of herbicides and plants. In addition, the Endangered Species Act protects critical habitat. Where are these species found? Some of them have critical habitat that has to be protected or the species won't survive. There's over 800 species of plants that are part of a critical habitat. So between the endangered and threatened species and the critical habitat, there's a lot of plants, and my society is worried. Because plants provide food and habitat to other listed species, if they're injured, it can lead to indirect effects. So merely injuring a plant habitat can affect listed terrestrial and aquatic species. So we look at direct and indirect effects when the agency is considering the impacts of pesticides on endangered species. So this is on the right is a nice map I got from Compliance Services. In the region, going from Virginia to Maine, there's 69 different species listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service. A lot of people think, well, in my state, I don't have any species. There's this extra 16 species of aquatic species listed by the National Marine Fisheries Service. In this map, the darker the color, the more species you have. Dr. Krishnan from University of Maryland loaned me the piece on the bottom, which looks at going from yellow, beige to red colors, the number of species by state. And if you look at DC, even the District of Columbia has species. By the way, the northern long-eared bat is one of those species. Going up the list, Connecticut, Delaware have 14 each. I live in Maryland. We've got 26 species. New York has 27. West Virginia has 32. So there's a lot of species around there. Underneath that, there's a little listing of the number of species. Plants are the largest with 19 species, and clams, which filter our water and help clean pollutants out of it, are the next group with 16. So there's a lot of species out there that you just may not know about and have never considered to be impacted by this. This is the same map from Compliance Services International, and it looks at the darker the color, the more species. So this is a map for all of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed species and the species listed by the National Marine Fisheries Service. Every county in the U.S. has an endangered species. Every county. So if you think that I don't have to worry about this, au contraire. Everybody has to consider this. Now, if you're in some place like Kansas, there's large areas where there's only a few species. If you're in some place like California with all the dark blue, or Florida and parts of West Virginia, you have a lot more species. So the more species, the more potential for interactions. This map is just a range of species listed by the National Marine Fisheries Service. And so if you're living in Kansas, sorry to pick on Kansas, you don't really have to worry about marine species. But if you're living in the state of Washington, even Idaho, if you're in Maryland, going up the coast, there's a lot of aquatic species that have to be considered. So as you look at this map, you'll see some of the rivers are followed quite a ways up, and it's because of spawning fish species. So I'd like to talk about what's going to be happening at the EPA in the next few years. So the court ordered the EPA to develop methods to speed up the review process. The agency has a backlog of over 1,100 active ingredients. So one of their ways to speed up the process is to create strategies to look at the different types of pesticides. So there was a herbicide strategy, a draft version was released, and a final version is expected in August of this year. And in fact, the EPA received so many comments that they requested from the court and got an extra 3 months to finalize the plan. There's a rodenticide strategy coming out. The final version should come out in November this year. There's an insecticide strategy scheduled for 2025. And I just want to point out the EPA is already considering ESA impacts for the neonicotinoid insecticides. There's a fungicide strategy scheduled for 2026. Biopesticides were mentioned. I have not seen a schedule yet. And I am not sure. I got one question about, are they going to consider non-ag products? I think that will be lower on their list, but I have not seen anything from the agency describing how they're going to do that. After those strategies have been finalized, it's going to take many years because all those actions that they're proposing, those mitigations, are going to have to find their way to individual labels. And I anticipate that's going to take several years. Now, on the other hand, I think that's good. That means that we will slowly start seeing changes at the user level with a few labels at a time instead of everything changing immediately. So I think a slower transition is a good thing. There's several federal agencies that work on this topic, and I'll just go through a little bit about their role. The Environmental Protection Agency, obviously, they look at pesticides. They have to work with the services to ensure that pesticide registrations do not jeopardize threatened and endangered species or adversely modify critical habitat. Their role is to modify labels, terms of registration to avoid those impacts. And as I said, they're now have stated they're going to be considering ESA impacts on all new registration decisions. The Fish and Wildlife Service, one of the services that is actually listed in the statute to regulate this, and they're part of the Department of Interior, they look at terrestrial species. They look at designating critical habitat. They develop protective regulations, and they develop recovery plans, modify the status of these species, etc. And they do work with non-federal partners to develop conservation plans. The National Marine Fisheries, part of NOAA, which is part of the Commerce, looks at the equivalent for marine species. And the USDA is involved in assessments. They look at impacts and they look at mitigations. And in addition, NRCS does have some small ESA grants, and I have seen people able to use those grants. Now, I just want to point something out. I've heard some great conversations. People have great ideas on how they can work to improve some of these mitigations, ways to make them work a little better. I just want to remind people that two federal agencies that are actually in charge of this process are the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. If you have great ideas, in addition to talking to the EPA, don't forget that sooner or later, you need to sell your idea to the services. They're the gatekeepers in this, and I want people to think about how you can sell these great ideas to the services. So ESA assessments, what the heck goes on? So the EPA starts, they get a whole series of studies submitted to them to look at protection of human health and the environment. And so they look at some of the existing studies and they say, for endangered species, will there be effects? So if there's no effects, then they just go on and they can make a registration decision. If it's not likely to adversely affect a listed species, they may have to do some additional work. They may have to put mitigations on the label. If it's likely to adversely affect, these species and the habitats are going to have to be further assessed by the services. And it depends on whether it's a fish and wildlife species or the National Marine Fisheries species. So if it's likely to adversely affect, they're going to have to do extra work. The services take those biological evaluations and conduct their own assessment. They look over the existing data, they see what they've been provided, they find other available information, and they provide a biological opinion. This determines if the species is in jeopardy or no jeopardy. If the action is likely to jeopardize the continued existence of a species or destroy or adversely modify the designated habitat. Pardon me. So they make a jeopardy determination. They also look at incidental take. So is this going to potentially kill, adversely impact one individual, or is it going to impact a large number of individuals? So they estimate the amount of take expected to occur. They look at critical habitat is going to adversely modify that habitat. And so they look at all that and they develop measures to protect these species. So they have a series of reasonable and prudent measures, things they would like users to do, and it's developed for non-jeopardy determinations. So even if there's no jeopardy, they may say, we would like to be very cautious and put these things on the label. The next level of even more impactful things are reasonable and prudent actions. And this is developed if they think jeopardy or adverse modifications are determined. And this would be even more stringent requirements on a label. So shifting gears a little bit, over the last couple of years, I've heard a lot of questions about Bulletins Live 2. And there's already several pesticide labels that direct you to visit Bulletins Live 2. There's a lot of confusion and I get a lot of questions about that. So we're going to go through an example of Bulletins Live 2 and how you might use that. So what's Bulletins Live 2? The user may need to check that if the label directs you to check Bulletins Live 2. The pesticide label will tell you to check that. And there's a link to that in the slide just above. If you check Bulletins Live 2 and print out what it tells you, that bulletin is good for up to 6 months. And why is it good for 6 months? That's because this website could be updated at any time. So the agency has made a commitment. If you print this out, a version of the bulletin, that's good for 6 months. And even if the website changes, you are protected for the next 6 months. So what we recommend people do is if you're told to check Bulletins Live 2, to print out the bulletin, read and follow limitations or mitigation requirements for the product. And I'll show you some of those in a minute. And we also recommend people print out the bulletin, even if there's no limitations within your application area, because that way you're covered in case the website changes in the next few months. The WSSA has some concerns about accessing the website. Internet access is very poor in some farm communities. In New Mexico, only 36% of farmers own or use a computer, and only 50% have internet access. New Mexico is the worst case, and that's according to a USDA NASS survey on computer usage and ownership for farms. Maryland, where I live, about 70% of farmers own or use a computer, and 80% have internet access. And that 80% would be either through a computer or a smartphone. New York, it's 69% of farmers own or use a computer and 81% have internet access. And we have raised these concerns to the agency. And in addition, some folks are unable to use their smartphone on Bulletins Live 2, so that's kind of a problem. A recent change, I'm not sure if this was just a one-off or what. If you enter the location and the date in Bulletins Live 2, but no product number, a couple times I've gotten it to show me all the restrictions in my state, which would be handy if you're, for example, if you're extension agent, you could go through and look for restrictions in your state. If you're a crop consultant, you could do that. But I've had other people do it at the same time and it did not work for them. So we're hoping the agency is going to make that change and make that a personal, permanent fix. So let's look at an example of Bulletins Live 2. This is Extendamax dicamba herbicide for over the top of herbicide-resistant cotton, soybeans, and corn. This is an example I pulled up for Auburn, New York. I typed in Auburn, New York. I typed in the month of May 2024. I typed in the registration number of 264-1210, which is on the Extendamax label. And what I got was 2 counties in pink where restrictions exist. And this is Onondaga and Madison counties in New York. If you have a farm in those areas, you should look at the restrictions and see if they affect you. So one of the things you would do is in the lower right corner, there's a way to look at the satellite icon. And in this case, this is a corner of Madison County and Oneida County. You need to be able to zoom in to figure out if your field is going to be impacted. Are you in that pink area? That pink area is called a pesticide use limitation area, a PULA. And I'm sorry, we'll be hearing more of that term. If the agency thinks the endangered species or their habitat and the use of dicamba overlap, they could, in a way that's harmful to those species, they will create a PULA for that herbicide. At the top right, there's a printable bulletin. If you click that, you would get the bulletin you would want to keep for your records, showing that my field is or is not in this area, and here's the restrictions. If you click on the button Full Details in the lower left, this is what you would see. And the full details in this case, the examples from Extendamax is the soybean mitigations. It talks about a 310-foot infield buffer and a 57-foot omnidirectional buffer. It talks about other kinds of buffers and then areas where those buffers are not required, if it's a gravel surface, mowed area, etc. So that would be the mitigations you need to consider for use of that herbicide. So it's pretty straightforward if the label, I think, if the label directs you to go to Bulletins Live 2, you would also make sure to write down the pesticide registration number because you're going to need that. And in some cases, just because of a lack of landmarks, you may also need to be able to put in the field based on the latitude and longitude, and you can do that as well. You can put in a city, a county, latitude, or longitude. I mentioned that lawsuits are driving this. The Endangered Species Act was part of what we call a mega lawsuit, and mega because it initially addressed a whole bunch of pesticides, hundreds of pesticides. That was since reduced down and targeted fewer pesticides. The lawsuit was brought about by the Center for Biological Diversity and the Pesticide Action Network. They filed this in 2011, and they said EPA was not carrying out its Endangered Species Act assessments as required. A settlement was finalized in 2023, and the court spelled out what the EPA had to do to settle this lawsuit. So it said the EPA had to start doing biological evaluations to see whether the pesticide may affect one of the listed species. They had to start developing strategy, and a strategy is, we talked about, is that way to try and speed up the process, to group herbicides, group insecticides, group fungicides, so that you could figure out mitigations across a number of pesticides in the same type. They also had to look at vulnerable species, and this is an attempt to look at, is there any generic way to look at vulnerable species as groups to start speeding up the review process. Another example of litigation, in 2019, Congress passed an amendment to the Endangered Species Act. One court negated that amendment, and a second court, all in the space of 1 year, came back and said, no, that amendment should stand. So litigations are still impacting the Endangered Species Act. So I just wanted to mention that the EPA has to go through and look at several different regulations. So all these registrations I like to think of them as a trade-off. The EPA and the registrants want effective pest control, but they want the minimum risks from this. And looking at listed species and their habitat is going to be just another series of trade-offs. So the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, is a risk-benefit statute. They look at risks such as risk to workers or the environment, and they look at benefits. Is this going to be a new mode of action for this crop? Is this going to be a tool for resistance management? Food Quality Protection Act only considers risks. So, for example, they consider risk to children and the general populace. Some risk examples might be food residues, water residues, offsite movement. The Endangered Species Act is another statute that only considers risks. So they have to make sure that any actions the EPA takes will not result in jeopardy or adversely modified critical habitats. So the agency has to juggle a bunch of different statutes. I just wanted to remind you that because this isn't an easy task. I want to give you a short example. What if there are risks to listed species or their habitat? One of the options is to remove states or counties from the label, reduce the rate, reduce the number of applications, remove a crop, put in an infield buffer, etc. I've heard of mitigations list with as high as 50 different options. There are many mitigation options. One of the things the agency is trying to do is give users a list and options, because not every farming situation is the same. So they are trying to provide mitigation lists. So I just wanted to go through a couple examples of ways they could address these risks. So one example is a new pesticide comes in and the agency is concerned about some risks. They could decide to immediately go into consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service. In the past, this has taken up to 5 to 6 years. And meanwhile, that pesticide cannot be used on those crops. So that means no one can use that product. So if they immediately go in consultation, that product's unavailable. Another option is to off-label all counties or states where those species are found to mitigate risk. Now, the trade-off here is it allows some pesticide use, so some areas can still use it instead of everybody being precluded from using it. And then the third example, C, is if new data becomes available, they can modify those restrictions. Enlist One used to have 200 counties that couldn't use the product, then 63 counties, and the very latest label, all counties can use the product. So as science brings in new evidence, they can modify those restrictions. So that's just 3 examples of how the agency could consider these. I was asked to go through an example. I'm going to use Enlist One. It's a herbicide that was just assessed for ESA impacts. It's over the top of corn, cotton, soybeans. The herbicide strategy draft has been released, but we're not really sure which items in their proposals will come out. As I said, they're rewriting it. The final version still is not out. So we thought it'd be better to look at an example that is out and is easy to point to. And as new labels are improved, enforcement can occur. Someone was asking when this would start, and I think it will start on a label by label basis. There's been some insecticides, chlorpyrifos, diazinon, and malathion have been assessed, and those were assessed on annual and perennial crops. So there are examples of perennial crops because the mitigation list may not be so attractive for perennial crops. I have not seen any example for forest or rangeland usage yet. Some general restrictions on the Enlist One. This was the January 23rd label of this year. And these are the mitigations to reduce drift and offsite movement. So general restrictions do not apply if soil is saturated or a storm event is likely to cause runoff that is forecast within the next 48 hours. Do not irrigate the field within 48 hours of an application. Check Bulletins live too before spraying. So this is a label that requires you to check Bulletins live. Spray drift, they prescribe nozzles, application height, large droplets, wind speed, etc. For mitigation, they have a requirement that on light soils, which are not likely to cause runoff, you have to come up with a minimum of 4 mitigation credits. If you're on heavy soils, which are prone to runoff, you have to get 6 mitigation credits. So they talk about reducing the number of applications, vegetative strips, cover crops, vegetated barriers, grassed waterways, etc. So they attempted to put in a number of mitigation options for you. When you think about the impacts of these species, I like to think of it's the intersection of the listed species. Where is their habitat? How toxic is the product being used? And where are those crops grown where that product may be used? So their habitat, their toxicity, and the exposure. And I wanted to introduce this because I'm going to go into a pilot study from Georgia where they looked at the listed species habitat and the exposure. So this is an example for Enlist Duo users at Georgia, and it's to protect the frosted flatwood and reticulated flatwood salamanders. This was work by University of Georgia, Dr. Stanley Culpepper and Dr. Taylor Randall Singleton. They worked with growers. They worked with Georgia Department of Agriculture, Fish and Wildlife Service, and EPA. So what did they do? Initially, the label restricted the application. There was 11 counties in Georgia where you couldn't use the material, and there was very large infield buffers, hundreds of feet in some cases, and the buffers. One of the things they looked at was where are the crops grown? And the EPA has something they call a crop data layer. And so do those layers accurately reflect where crops are grown? This is one example where they discovered a 30-year-old subdivision was being listed as potential cropland. Well, I'm pretty sure they're not growing crops there and haven't for the last 30 years. So what did they do? They improved the maps for the species, working with Fish and Wildlife Service. The salamanders live in high grass with forests, and they spend their reproductive cycles in wetlands. Well, an awful lot of cropland is not encompassed with forests and tall grass. So they went from 100% of 11 counties down to 0.33%. They are still protective of those species, but they got down to a level where it was only that habitat being protected. So they went from 900,000 acres down to 3,500 acres. So about a little over a 99% reduction. So the species are still being protected, but farms are much less impacted like this. So I think their pilot program was incredibly helpful. I just wanted to point out the WSSA got concerned about endangered species, and that was Stanley Culpepper was the president of the Weed Science Society and decided to create our subcommittee. We had a webinar in 2022. We created our committee in 2022 as well. We had a workshop in January of 2023, and I'm proud to say that the two scientists that worked on the Georgia pilot study are both members of our committee. One of the things I wanted to point out that for folks out there that could be helpful, we have a website, wssa.net/endangered species. Anyone can get on this. It's listed at the bottom. We have a series of questions just to tell you what is the act. These are just very basic written descriptions of what it is and how this is going to impact you. We also have links to Bulletins Live 2 and a short explanation of how to use it. We have a glossary of terms, acronyms, and definitions because there's a lot of new terminology. A link to EPA's webpage on the ESA, and also link to the two services lists and locations of species. I'd like to say that if you don't know you have species, it's hard to protect them. So this has links to the two services, and those give you lists by state of all the endangered species in your state. We tried to give nice basic information suitable to applicators, consultants, extension, and growers. And it's wssa.net/endangered species. Future considerations, I just wanted to point out, you're going to need to worry about this. Again, it's the intersection of the application site and the listed species. These decisions are going to be made at a field level, not a farm level. So we're going to have to start thinking about individual fields. Can you find the field on a map? If you have to go to Bulletins Live 2, you might need to write down the latitude and longitude. If the mitigation list contains mitigation, conservation practices, you're going to have to know at the field level what conservation practices are going on. I've talked to many growers who said, you know, I work with NRCS and they've got all that information. I don't even have access to it. In the future, you may need to figure out ways to get access to that. There's some rumors that suggest the EPA might give conservation credits for being in a state or federal conservation program. I don't know if that's true. If so, then you yourself would just have to know if your field is in one of those state or federal programs. I think there's no reason to be concerned at this point. No herbicide has ever been fully removed from the market based solely on ESA risks. I think that's unlikely in the future. Getting pesticide registrations into compliance is going to take time. I think it's going to take a number of years. Only a few of the 300 herbicides have been assessed for endangered species. The ESA has been successful in preserving 99% of the species. 291 species have been removed from the list. The process is going to take a long time, I think. But on the other hand, I think this is a great time to work collectively on this program and this problem. The EPA, Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, registrants, and many other groups are all working on this problem and process. And the Weed Science Society is trying to help too. So my name is Bill Chisholm. My email address is carlysbarn@gmail.com. Carly's the cat that's pretty sure she's in charge of the barn. And I'd like to turn this over to Mike Hunter.
All right, thank you very much, Bill. That was very informative. So we do have a couple of questions and we have some time for that. Also, you can see that we do have the CCA CEUs for those that want to log on to get their credit. That screen is up there right now. So question for you, Bill, will enforcement be reactionary or will local state agencies be checking for compliance?
That's a great question. I was at a meeting with state regulators and they're still trying to figure out their path forward. So I think that could be on an individual state basis.
Another question we have, will these changes affect non-listed species that are of concern or proposed for listing? For example, the greater sage grouse.
Oh, great question. As it has been explained to me, currently they are only looking at listed species. So if some are being proposed for listed, those would not be part of this assessment yet. And they may be at some future date.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, one more question here. What happens when endangered species conflict? For example, a no spray zone to protect a plant species means uncontrolled invasive plants damage a bird species.
Another great question. We have been trying to, it's still early in this whole process, figure out how to have productive discussions about controlling invasive species versus protecting listed species. There's been several cases where Fish and Wildlife Service has successfully used herbicide to remove invasive species and protect listed species. So we know it's happened. We're just not sure about the framework of how to make that work yet.
Okay, thank you. One more question here. Everything we hear says this is only for ag products, but how will products that have ag uses but labeled in other areas, for example, aquatics, be exempted?
That another great question. I envision the agency looked at ag products first because they have the most information. I think they understand how they're used much better than some of the other sites. So I think they started with ag products first, but I know they're going to have to address all products. So I think it's just them working their way through all the sites and locations and et cetera, and they'll have to come up with that.
We have many pesticides are commercially applied. To what extent have crop consultants and ag chemical companies been involved in the process or been informed of these rules?
I another good question. I think at one level, everybody knows this is coming, but I know for a fact that as you move down the ranks of companies, less and less information is getting out there. I think when the herbicide strategy is released and everyone has a clearer understanding of what might be coming, I think there'll be more information out there. But that's one of the reasons why the WSSA got involved. We want to start telling people this is coming so they can start thinking about it. And I know the EPA has a group dedicated to communications products, and they're starting to work through this whole process too and figure out who to tell and when to tell them, et cetera.
Okay, if the conservation practices are supposed to be on a per field level, is there no concern about farmers taking out windbreaks between fields to make fewer larger fields?
Good question. When I look at some of the descriptions, we don't have a clear description of what a field is yet, and I'm not sure when we'll get that from the agency because, as you know, that's not an easy topic to figure out. The impacts of those decisions could come to pass, but I don't know. What growers are going to do in response to these new ESA mitigation practices, I don't know. I hope it's not. We all hope it's not catastrophic.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Bill. Reading a question. How might ecologists and biologists support growers during the next 3 to 5 years as this unfolds?
That's a great question. One of the things my committee had was a really great discussion with Botanical Society of America, trying to figure out how we could work together on this. I think as we start looking at the species and trying to understand where they are, we're going to lean heavily on ecologists to try and figure out and other disciplines to find out where these habitats are, where the species are, and be able to give really good, clear descriptions of it. I keep saying it, not only do you have to know you have an endangered species, but right now I don't even know how to recognize the habitat. And so being able to provide information on the habitat, what the species look like, where they're found, when they're found would be really important. And I think those other groups are the ones that can explain that to us.
I just wanted to thank Bill again for a wonderful presentation. Really appreciated the information. Very clear, very informative. I know in the PSEP world, we're all eager to have this kind of information to present to our audiences, so I appreciate it personally. I'd also like to thank everyone for attending today. Appreciate your time, and hopefully you found a lot of informative information from this webinar. So again, thanks everyone for attending, and we appreciate it.